welcome to Nicki Talks. Today is my fifth in 6 shows in a series about domestic violence to recognize October as National Domestic Violence Month. And today I'm really happy to welcome Ross Steinborn, who is with the YWCA North Shore Rape Crisis Center. Welcome, Ross.
Thank you, Nicki. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I thought we could start a little bit and maybe you could tell people about the Rape Crisis Center and where is it and what's kind of your scope of services and what areas, what geographic areas?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So the YWCA North Shore Rape Crisis Center, we have 3 offices. We have one main office in Lynn, Massachusetts, and then we serve the whole North Shore, actually, so including Cape Ann and Gloucester. Our other 2 satellite offices, we have one in Newburyport, where we share some offices with YWCA there on Tuesdays, and then we share offices with NAGLI in Salem, Massachusetts. And then as far as services go, anybody who's a survivor of sexual assault, or a sexual abuse or sexual harassment could qualify. We serve 12 people 12 and up. And that includes confidential, so what that means is no insurance, we take a first name and a last initial, and so we can do empowerment-based counseling. We do legal medical advocacy. So the way I like to explain those is that we're not nurses or doctors, but we can kind of be a moral support if somebody decides to get a sexual assault kit done, like a rape kit done at the hospital. And then the same thing with the legal side. So we're not lawyers, but we can be kind of a moral support if somebody wants to get a harassment order against their perpetrator or actually wants to make a complaint, a criminal complaint with the police department.
And do you have a hotline?
Yeah, so a couple more things. We have a hotline. That's 877-509-9922.
Okay, thanks.
And then we also actually are offering a drop-in group for survivors. It's a little bit new, what we're trying out. So instead of it being a group that builds up, that you come to every week, it's a group where if you just need to drop in and get a little bit of, and just like help coping with the thing, so that's what we're kind of trying right now. So we just had so that's going to be in the Lynn office. Okay. And that's every other Wednesday. So we just had our first one yesterday. So the next one will be October 16th, and that's at 6 p.m. if people are interested.
Great.
So,
Yeah, that's great. That's really needed. So it could be anyone from a teenager to an elder.
And the way I understood the groups, and I wasn't at the first one, but the way I understood how they wanted to run those was just kind of focusing in on a particular emotion kind of every week, right? And so how can that emotion be affected by trauma, by being a survivor, or a non-offending loved one, right? So a support of a survivor. Which I didn't mention before, we also supports, I guess. We see secondary trauma survivors. So we'll see partners.
That's really important to know. That's great.
So partners, or so if your partner was assaulted, even if it was like a long time ago and you're just hearing about it, we definitely hear from people like people who've been in that situation, or parents whose children were assaulted. We'll work with folks like that as well.
Yeah, that's great. So if I called the hotline and I'm 65 years old and I say I just had this memory of being sexually assaulted, I would be able to receive services free of charge, anonymous, confidential.
Absolutely. Okay. And we actually see a lot of scenarios quite like that. And it really kind of can be driven by the news at the time. So during the Kavanaugh hearings, for example, a lot of folks calling up saying, man, I've been...
That happened in my practice.
It
just triggered so many memories for people.
And I'm 65 years old. This happened to me when I was... in high school. I thought I was over it, but the news cycle just brought this up, and that was perfect. And we were able to work with that person over the phone and didn't have to see her in person, but if she wanted to come in person,
there was some support available, which is great. So, how did you end up? What's your journey been to get to what you're doing now? I know we've been colleagues for a while, but I don't know how long you've been at the Rape Crisis Center. But
so I've been at the YWCA North Shore Rape Crisis Center for 4 years. So April will be my 5th. And then before I was at the Rape Crisis Center in the North Shore, I was at a Rape Crisis Center in Milford, Massachusetts for about a year. My route here was a windy one, if you will. So I have my master's from Harvard in Master of Divinity, from Harvard Divinity School. And there I was hoping to do PhD work where I was studying Christian theology and gender studies. And then ancient Greek happened, so I decided not to do. I decided I was a little bit burnt out.
Blew it out of the water.
And then did an internship my last semester there, or my last year there, with Harvard's Office of Sexual Assault Prevention and Response, which is kind of Harvard campus's kind of mini rape crisis center. And that's kind of where, and I was like, oh, this is really interesting work. It fits in with my own passions around gender and very much thinking about masculinity and violence. So at the time, so that's kind of how I got into it. So.
That's how you link all the trains together. Maybe we could take a second to talk about, as I know many people experience some confusion around all the different terms that we use in domestic violence or rape or sexual assault. So I put some of the words down just thinking to myself, there's sexual harassment, there's sexual assault, there's rape, there's human trafficking, there's, and people, I think, and the reason I like to bring it up is that I think when people get, swirly about the definitions, they stop focusing on the important stuff.
Right.
And I know it's up to them, it's on them to learn them, but I think it's helpful to. So how would you make a couple of different differentiations there?
Before I make a distinction, I think it's important to kind of tie them all together, right?
Good.
And so instead of getting really confused in what distinguishes them, I think it's important to recognize that all of them, sexual assault, sexual abuse, sexual harassment, human trafficking, are a violation of somebody's sexual boundaries, right? And so if somebody says, I have this sexual ethic or the sexual boundary, and to violate that, to break that, to ignore it, to abuse it, is how I think I would put in. That's kind of the overarching definition, if you will.
Yeah, totally.
So sexual assault is any unwanted sexual contact, which then I guess we could talk about sexual abuse, which is when sexual assaults happen to a person over and over again. So they're constant. They're in a situation where they can't easily get out of that situation. So when we think of sexual abuse, we're often thinking of children. So like the sexual abuse of children, because their perpetrator, the person violating their sexual boundaries, their bodily autonomy, usually have a ton of power over them. Parents, some other adult, and they don't know how to get out of that. Some places in sexual abuse that we often forget about are elderly and disabled as well, where those same kind of dynamics can exist. Sexual harassment then, I often think of sexual harassment as place, right? So where is it taking place at? And so sexual harassment does kind of is a bit more of a legal term, if you will, that's kind of denoting a sexual assault or some kind of unwanted sexual contact or non-contact in a workplace or in a school environment. And so, and that's when we start to talk about sexual assault. So the Me Too movement is very much focused on sexual. I'm sorry, it was very much focused on sexual harassment, right? And focusing on there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, okay. That's great. Thank you.
You had mentioned a couple others. Do you want to stop there? Or?
No, that's good. Okay, I mean, this is 2 or 3 shows worth of information, so we're just going to have to
absolutely
somehow cut to the chase here, but there's a lot to say. I wanted to talk about prevention and education, but before we do that, let's just take a minute to talk about the intersection between domestic violence and sexual assault and rape.
It's a great question. How those two, how domestic violence or intimate partner violence and
Yes.
And sexual assault kind of intermingle.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to think of the best way to talk about it. I guess as you know, and maybe a lot of your viewers don't know, up until 1991 in the state of Massachusetts, marital rape wasn't illegal, right? And so. And the way it was phrased was something along the lines of rape was defined as the forcible carnal knowledge of a woman not your wife, right? And so there was this caveat
specific.
it's very specific.
Yeah.
It very much defined who could be victims of rape, women, and who could be perpetrators of rape, men.
Yep.
And it also took out the relationship between a man and a woman, or a husband and a wife in that whole definition, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's a cultural artifact, if you will, that still kind of hangs around, right? So, and we often get clients come in and don't recognize, they'll say, I didn't even know that I could say no to my husband. I didn't know that was possible, that it was illegal, that for him to force himself on me. And it's not only in marriages, right? It's also in dating relationships. And we see that even with young kids and starting out their dating relationships, is like as soon as they say they're dating somebody, they have this anticipation that person's body belongs to them, right? That I get mad if you don't want me to touch me, you know, I get mad if you won't let me hold your hand, right? Or so we definitely start to see that kind of ignoring consent early on when we start to talk about dating and relationships, and that's kind of the connection.
Yeah.
And I would say, like, as an abusive relationship escalates to a place where there's physical violence, it wouldn't surprise me if there was also unspoken sexual violence there as well.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I agree. I mean, and I've certainly seen that a lot.
Yeah.
It's interesting, but my sense from the great distance of my years, my sense is that I'm really taking a leap here by sounding ancient, but that sexual mores and sexual practices have changed a lot between the age bracket of maybe 12 to 15 in that, and I kind of see that just in my work. And there's so many different kinds of definitions in terms of your sexual encounters, everything from hooking up to, other things that I won't mention on TV. But how does that affect, do you think, going over that line and being a perpetrator?
Yeah, that actually leads me, I think, that's actually a great segue into talking about prevention education work.
Yeah.
And into consent, right? Like for
us
at the Rape Crisis Center, the one thing, so anytime we go into do a presentation for schools or a youth group, we always say, we're not here to tell you what to do or when to do it, or what not to do. We're here, in our whole conversation, we want to base it around when and if you choose to have sex or engage in any kind of sexual activity, we want that to be the best possible experience for everybody involved.
Yeah.
Right? So how do we have, what do we need, what kind of conversations, what kind of an awareness do we need about our partner's boundaries and values, and about our own boundaries and values to get to that place, right? And so, I think that there is a lot of confusion and a lot of pressure to have sex.
Yeah. Young, very young.
Yeah. But I don't know that. I don't know that today's teens are really any more promiscuous than before. In fact, a lot of research shows that today's teens are actually taking a lot less risky behaviors than even my generation or your generation.
Right.
And a lot of that there's a flip side to a lot of that in the research, is that they're actually not, the reason they're not taking risky behaviors is because they're on social media all the time and not actually hanging out with each other to take the risky behavior.
Absolutely,
but there's
that
a
makes
flip,
sense.
there's a bit of a flip coin there. But nonetheless, I think I actually really enjoy going into the schools nowadays, because the students are really quite aware of consent already. And I think a lot of what the field I'm in has been trying to do, I would say, for the 5 years that I've been in the field, and even before, it was really starting to take hold, right? And we've really started to see that, and a lot of help in that from like the Obama administration's focus on campus sexual assault to the Me Too movement of the time now has really helped, I think, to start to define consent for people, and that's a word that people know.
Yeah. Yeah. And how many educators are out, people in that role are at the Rape Crisis Center?
Yes, so there are, I'm going to do a head count. Yeah. Because there's 4 of us right now.
Okay.
And that's it. I mean, there's 4 of us in the office. We're a fairly small office at the North Shore.
And is there a mix
Center.
of like direct service, prevention, education?
Because we're so small, we really tried to be jack of all trades in the group. So my title is community outreach coordinator. Okay. So I do a lot of the community outreach stuff, but at the same time, I'm seeing clients and advocating for folks as well. So we're all kind of doing a little bit of everything.
It's a pretty tall order.
Yeah.
Not unlike Hawk.
It's
just 23 cities and towns. It's kind of 4 of us. Excuse me.
Yeah.
So here's the trick question, ready?
Okay, yep.
So back when you started in this work, which as you say is close to 5 years ago, it must have been unusual for a man to come forward, answer a hotline, and talk to somebody who's been victimized by rape or sexual assault.
Yeah, it can, there's still not many of us across the state. On last count that I knew of, there was I think 4 of us in the state.
I believe it.
Yeah. We actually have a volunteer and now a young man interning for us actually, who's also a man and very interested in the work too. So I think 2 things about it. The first is that one of the things it does, I think, is it pushes the field, which really started out of the feminist movement in the 80s, to really start to think about the ways in which we put up barriers for male survivors, which we do.
Yes.
And I really hope that we're starting to break those down. We're really starting to understand or pull out the differences between men and female survivors, because there are a lot, and our focus on female survivors had really created our spaces around that, right, and our responses to disclosures around how female survivors disclose, and really not a big focus on how male survivors disclose. So one of the hopes is that we're a bit better at that, right?
Yeah.
Accepting male survivors or hearing their stories.
Yeah, or inviting them to.
Right. And being in that space, right? Because it can be hard. One, for men to. I mean, there's a lot of cultural resonance there, right? So it can be very hard for men to come forward and say, "I was sexually assaulted,"
Absolutely.
and it can be really actually hard for people to hear that. It's not like our advocates aren't also immersed in our own culture, right? People, right? Yeah, and it can be hard to hear that when you're not used to it too.
Sure.
So that changed.
Yeah.
The other thing I think is interesting, I've had clients come in and say, I don't know how comfortable I'm going to be. Female clients come in and say, I don't know how comfortable I'm going to be with a male advocate. And the one thing I always say is, and I imagine that's because their perpetrator was a male, and they're almost always like, yes.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, one of the challenges here could be for you to have an experience with a male that is different, right? And so that is more positive.
Yeah.
And so I not always, but every now and then I've challenged clients in that way as well too. So.
Yeah. Well, and that's part of the hope of, of having a male advocate. It's that it breaks through those barriers. Yeah. It's interesting. I was reading, I think I might have shared this with you before, but I was reading a study, I can't remember exactly what it was, about male juvenile offenders. And they were incarcerated in, I forget, maybe the Midwest. And they were doing theater work with them. It was, I forget the name, it was a fabulous program.
Yeah.
And the kids created stories about themselves. And the focus was on trauma.
Yeah.
So they told their stories of trauma. These are all males. But the perpetrator of the trauma was not in the scenario. So it was like they were sort of creating their own sort of hope in their own stories and presenting them to other inmates.
And they were talking about their own stories of trauma, their own victimization?
Yeah. And one of the things the study pointed out was that 99.9% of them had experienced some kind of sexual trauma, and that the sexual trauma was in fact kind of like the gateway or the skids to addiction, criminal activities around the addiction, and then incarceration.
Yeah.
So that, it's sort of like, I mean, I really believe this, that if you scratch the surface of someone who's struggling ongoing, there's trauma in there.
Trauma there.
And very often it's sexual trauma.
A lot of times.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the barriers, I was talking about barriers, and this isn't just a barrier for male survivors, but female as well.
Yeah.
But it's a barrier that our field sets up, and it's in our language, right? We talk about survivors and perpetrators, right? Survivors and perpetrators, and we make this duality or this binary where you can't be both, right?
You can't be both a perpetrator
and a survivor, right?
Gotcha.
And that's almost always, especially for male survivors. That's a lot of times not the case, right? A lot of times people, like you said, you scratch the surface of a lot of incarcerated folks who are perpetrators, and some of them sexual perpetrators, right? Sexual assault perpetrators. There's trauma there too. They're also victims, right? And so breaking that binary is, I think, in our own language as a field, is a really important step going forward and thinking that through.
And there is a lot written about like juvenile sex offenders, that they themselves were victims, at some point in their history.
And I don't want to mislead the audience. It's those statistics can be really quite confusing. So
true enough,
it is the case that most perpetrators of sexual violence are victims at some point in their lives, have experienced sexual abuse. However, most people who experience sexual abuse don't go on to become perpetrators.
That's a really good distinction.
Those are huge distinctions.
That's really important. So do you think that, I mean, you mentioned this, but do you think that just the movement in the country around Me Too and Time's Out, and do you think that has literally brought you more clients, that people have reached out in a way they might not have because there's a light shining?
I think it's a bit of a double-sided coin. In all honesty, I think the space is there for us to be active in the community, and I think we're trying to be better at doing that. I also think that if we weren't active in the community, Me Too and the Time's Up movement have actually created a space for people to talk about their their own trauma with their own support networks, right? And so it used to be the case that like this was a silent thing. I didn't talk about it. I was sexually assaulted or raped, and that's why we set up hotlines, right? That's why we had these places where we're very, very set up to be confidential, and that's like. That was because of when we were set up in the 80s, right? But now, it's okay to talk about those things, right? They're not as taboo to say I'm a sexual assault survivor, right? To a partner or to a support group. And so I think that we still play a role, but it's a role where we need to be more active in the community as advocates to say no, you don't have to go through this by yourself.
And we just have a little bit of time left, but I wanted to touch upon, and you have a little bit already, but the issue of sexual assault and rape among the LGBTQ community, and the barriers to coming forward, and maybe you could just talk for a second about that.
It's a
big topic.
It's a tough.
You got 1 second.
You're good. The problem with LGBTQ sexual assault stats is that there aren't a lot. The research out there suggests that it's higher than the non-LGBTQ community, but
what's higher?
I'm sorry, the rates of victimization among LGBTQ folks is higher, and that's within so it is a very tough thing because we don't know a ton about it, or if we are learning more about it, I haven't kept up with that research. So it makes it more challenging. And then on top of that, the ostracization of the community generally has, I think, made it harder to come forward for some folks. And that's especially true, I think, for the trans community. where there are very few numbers, but
very few numbers because they
very few statistics
so
on
it's tip
on
of the
perpetration.
iceberg type.
Yeah, we just don't know a lot about it. But the thought pattern, the thought is that it's actually very high in that community. The perpetrations, or victimization is very high in that community. So it's definitely a challenge, and one that I hope our agency gets better at responding to as well. So.
Yeah, that's a great answer. It sounds like it's an ongoing. Yeah.
And in fact, we're doing, we have a new partnership with NAGLY, which is the North Shore Alliance for Lesbian and Gay Youth, situated in Salem. And so we're hopefully going to be starting to really build out a lot of our prevention education work into that community.
Oh, that's great.
So that's
great.
the hope. So hopefully you ask me this question in a year or so, and I have a much more succinct answer.
I like that. It's a great partnership with NAGLY. And then finally, maybe you could talk, this is sort of a 2-point question. First of all, how you think someone in a community or a family or even a work setting, or how could that person be an ally to, somebody who's being victimized? And then the second part is, and there's probably one answer to this, but what can you tell people? What do you feel is the most important thing for people to understand about, the Rape Crisis Center, but about the work of the Rape Crisis Center?
So the first question, if somebody talks to you or discloses a sexual assault or sexual trauma in their past, again, I would say to start by believing. Right, is what we always say, and I think a lot of times there's this kind of this rush to try to figure out what's to fix it or to figure out what's real, and recognize that, especially if it's a loved one or you're a person's support group, that your role isn't a detective, right? And if your friend or partner or a child want to go to the police, there are detectives who have that role to figure out what happened, right? But our job as loved ones and supports is to believe first, right? And to say, I believe you, and let them know they're not going to go through it alone, right? That it is going to be challenging, but that healing does happen, and they're not going to be alone in that. And then the second question, I think the only thing I would add is because I'm the community outreach coordinator and I focus on prevention, I would add, I think it's really important for us to continue the conversation about consent and bodily autonomy. What does it mean to respect somebody's sexual boundaries? What does that look like, and how do we respect how do we start to learn about our own sexual values and respect those boundaries of our partners?
Yeah, I think it's challenging for young people anyway to express their consent and their boundaries.
Yes.
It's kind of an important language to learn.
And it's not just young people. It's tough for anybody to express that. So it's important.
And do you think a bystander can intervene?
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of times when we talk about bystander intervention, the first thought that pops into people's brains is when I'm at the club and I see like somebody taking advantage of a drunk person, right, and I intervene there. And people, if they're comfortable, should totally take steps to do that. Yeah. But when I think about bystander intervention, and I think the place that we often miss is our own friends group, right?
Yes.
Like, it's much more easier for me to say, to my good friend or to a family member that I respect and love, like to say, hey, the way that you treated your girlfriend made me really uncomfortable, or, man, this person's like really quite drunk, maybe you should like just get her number and we could, you could go from there. You know?
That's great.
But much easier to confront or to call in a friend or or a loved one than try to intervene in with strangers. I mean, if you're comfortable doing that, please.
No, but I think that's good because that's really how change happens. It's right in your own.
I mean, change happens at home.
It does.
First, for sure.
Okay, well, we're out of time.
Okay,
so thanks so
you.
much,
Yeah,
Ross.
thank you
nice
very
to
much.
see you.
Yeah.